Hi, I'm Donna Ottaviano Bray with another episode of Joyful Disciples, and I am so excited to bring to you our guest today, Chris Lowney. And Chris Lowney, you may be familiar with him. He actually is an author of 6 books. One is Heroic Leadership, which you may have come across. It is used often in corporate leadership circles as well as church leadership circles. But he's also the author of Everyone Leads: How to Revitalize the Catholic Church. And so we're going to spend some time talking with Chris today around why he wanted to write this book, why it was important for him to bring it forward, and what it can do for us as laity and clergy as we think about how we do the work that Jesus has called us to in this century. But there's a really great nugget in Chris's story. We know how important story is in all of the work that we do. The story of Jesus and the Kerygma, which is his birth, his life, his death and resurrection, as well as our own stories and walks in faith. We know that those are important. But Chris is actually born in New York, from New York, and he really doesn't like the Yankees. And without shame, he roots for the Mets. So Chris, can you share with us a little bit about where that came from?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a simple answer to that question. If you grow up in Jackson Heights on 93rd Street and you're like a 20-minute walk from Shea Stadium, some people call it Citi Field now, but for us it's Shea Stadium still, then you end up rooting for the Mets.
Really?
And I always say to people that being Catholic is a wonderful preparation for being a Mets fan, because being a Mets fan means lots of suffering, and we Catholics understand how to make sense of suffering. So, yeah. So I grew up rooting for the Mets and still root for the Mets. And I mean, I presume in your diocese you have some Phillies fans.
We do.
So I hate the Yankees, but unfortunately, I'm sorry, guys. I also hate the Phillies.
My husband tells a great story around the 1960 championship, and that it was the Yankees up against the Pittsburgh team, and it really looked as though Pittsburgh was going to fall to the Yankees. So he and his mother were watching, and they prayed a Hail Mary, and a player named Mazeroski hits a walk-off ninth inning home run to win the game. So, there's Catholic context all over for, the way we play our sports and which teams we root for. So thanks for sharing a little bit of yourself with us around that. I appreciate it. But Chris, I would like to transition now into the book, Everyone Leads: How to Revitalize the Catholic Church. So can you share a little bit with us of your story of what drew you to write this book, where the idea came from, and why is it important to us?
So, so let me lead up to with 2 or 3 quick background pieces. So I myself, I'm a cradle Catholic, educated in Catholic schools, taught a bit in Catholic schools, and have always been in one way or another involved. So I feel like I have a really good firsthand feel for the wonderful things that we can bring to the world right now as a church. So I have a strong sense of that. You mentioned some of the things that I've written. A lot of what I've written in a way has been somehow touched by Christian or Catholic spirituality or tradition. In some ways, even though I often write for corporate audiences, the books have felt a little bit like what our spiritual traditions, how they might help us to be better, more effective leaders. Okay? And in a way, Everyone Leads, the book you're asking about, was kind of the flip side of that. In other words, I came from the place of, something, we have a lot to offer to the world right now, but we have some big, big challenges as a church. And I feel like we have to take advantage of best practices, good ideas, new ideas from wherever we get them, whether it's from organizational life, family life, corporate life, our own tradition. So let's have a very open sense of where we can get good ideas. And so I built the book kind of around that. And in a way, the very bottom line of the book is saying that, in order for us to achieve what we want to achieve as a church in this very difficult, complicated century, we have to go through a real culture change. In other words, we have to think about things and do things kind of a different way in order to be successful. And that's really what the book is about.
So I really love the way you've set up the conversation, because that's the great struggle, to think about. What Catholics need to think about is, do things a different way. And it's a very interesting thing that you comment on, is the culture. Like, how does our culture need to change? How do we do it? What are the elements of that? And so, because of where I function in the diocese and I work with lots of clergy, mostly pastors, and lots and hundreds of lay people across the diocese that are on fire to do something for our church, but sometimes thinking, okay, what is that? And they don't think of themselves necessarily as leaders. So what's kind of an important consideration, like one or two nuggets, if you're a lay person in a parish, you don't necessarily work for the parish, you're not someone like me that works for the diocese, like what do you really need to think about, or what's important to you
Right.
as you go forward in that work?
So let me start with one big picture, bottom line one, and then we can move on to others if you want. So, whether it's a family, a business, the Catholic Church, we're living in a time where, everybody understands the world is getting more complex. We face more challenges. Things happen too quickly. Everybody has to cope with that. We as a church have to cope with that. At the same time, our population that we've traditionally as a church thought of stereotypically as like our leadership group, priests, bishops, so on, that population is shrinking.
Mhm.
And that reality of multiplying problems and shrinking cohort of like your stereotypical leaders, that will never work. I mean, it doesn't work in any kind of scenario. So just on a human level, we need to put it colloquially, get more people into the game.
Mhm.
And a lot, that's a culture change for us. Like, in other words, the way we grew up, we never thought of ourselves as somehow part of having to co-own or be co-responsible for these challenges, for these problems. We kind of showed up and did what we were supposed to do. But we imagined, yeah, well, the priests, people in the rectory, the others, they have those things under control. And that really won't work. So when I say everyone leads, of course, I'm not saying like, okay, well, next Sunday, I'm going to go up and say Mass. Of course, I'm not talking about that. But I am saying that, all of the things that have to go into, gee, how do we reach out to other people? How do we make sure that our parish is really welcoming? How do we make sure that we have good programs to serve the poor, blah, 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 blah? That a lot more of us will have to get in the game to do that. And sometimes a parish is really up for that. Like the pastor is all on board with that, the people are all on board with that. But more often, maybe the pastor's all up for that, but the people aren't. I mean, or vice versa.
Mhm. Right.
And that's the nature of culture change. In other words, it's kind of uncomfortable. It takes some work. It doesn't always go smoothly at first, but you have to kind of hang in there and try, because the objective, what we're aiming to accomplish, is so worthy that it's worth hanging in there through the struggle.
Yeah, that's the hard part, I find, as we kind of work through this, and we're taking a series of small steps here in the Camden Diocese, and parish by parish. And every parish is taking a look across its own community, right? Because local knowledge is expert, right? So the really taking a look at who's in need and how might we meet those needs. So can you address a question possibly in all of the different places that you speak and all the people you've interviewed, and you look at where the successes have been? We talk about let's try things and fail fast, and as a culture, Catholic Church doesn't like failure. We're like, oh no, no failure for us. What is it like? Because the frustration for even laity, and I would gather for the priest too, is to get more people to come into the work, to join us. So where do you think sort of the nexus is on how do we get more people to join us? What are some of the things for the people that actually are viewing this episode and like, okay, I would love to know how to get more of my fellow parishioners to join me? Where have you seen that has worked, or barriers that have been overcome around that?
Yeah. I mean, I might say a couple of things. First thing is, I don't have the magic answer. I mean, we're not, as a church, we're not stupid people. If there was easy answers to the problems of like, how do we get more people engaged? Or how do we reach out, for example, to young people? If there were like formulas that guaranteed success, of course, we'd all have figured it out by now, right? So I think the first thing to say is just to accept the fact that, unfortunately, there are no magic solutions. And just because we don't feel we're making great progress right away, it doesn't mean like we're the dolts and everyone else is going great, you know? So I think the first thing is just to accept, all right, it's a difficult problem. Difficult problems don't have easy answers. First thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is, you know, unfortunately, I don't think the old way of doing it is really gonna get us there. In other words, just to put in the bulletin, these are the groups we have, we could use more help. I mean, the people would have shown up if they were gonna show up.
Right.
And to me, you know, at the end of the day, there's nothing like, I'm sorry, Mary, or, you know, Joe, I think you really could add a lot of value here. Is there some way we could interest you to come here and step up and work with us?
Yeah, and I love that
Uh,
example, Chris, because personal invitation,
Absolutely.
recognizing somebody's gifts or talents or what their contributions are, because I think our pews are actually filled with people
Without a
looking
doubt.
for a way to contribute, and they just haven't been invited in, or the way we put it in the bulletin potentially or advertised from the podium at mass announcements, et cetera, is those are the traditional things that maybe they don't think they have gifts or skills for, or that's not the way they're seeking to
Yeah.
contribute to this.
So that's first thing I would say. You know, you have to ask people. Second thing I would say is, you know, celebrate easy wins is a cliche I use. Like, in other words, when something is going well, or when somebody has stepped up to try something and there's at least a glimmer of hope, to kind of publicize that, make that known, because I think that helps to generate a little bit of momentum. And maybe the person who is a fence sitter and says, oh, you know, I mean, I just don't know if I could sign up for the hassle or whatever. Sometimes to hear, well, you know, there are some things happening, or my neighbor is involved. Sometimes that helps to generate a tiny bit of momentum. So that's a second thing I would say, you know, to kind of make sure that we are talking about when things are going a little bit well, or when folks are stepping up.
Yeah, and I think that's true too. And I believe lately I heard, it may actually have come from Bishop Barron, but we really as church, we have not done a very good job of telling the world why we do the things we do. We do them because Jesus taught us that these are the things that we have to do, right? What did Jesus tell us? To love and to serve. You know, so who are we loving and who are we serving? Because there are so many people right in our own communities that need all of that. So what I hear you talking about, which is a theme from your book, right, is resilience. We have to be resilient in all of these things that we're doing. And we cannot, I know that I cannot quote, you know, chapter and verse out of the Bible, but there is a verse from Isaiah that talks about, I shall not grow weary. You know, so that's something that's really important, you know, for us as Catholics to remember. What did Jesus teach us to do? Love and serve, go out and look in the community. And I love your whole idea of, right, talk about it with your neighbor, right? And invite them into the work that way.
Yeah. You know, I'll say, let me say something about resilience in first a human organizational way, and then in a more spiritual Catholic way. You know, in a human way, you know, one of the things that's always interesting to me is if you look at these people who've been very successful, like in startups.coms, you know, you tend to look at them and you say, oh man, you know, look at this guy had this great idea. Now he's a billionaire. He's so successful. And often, more often than not, not always, but more often than not, the resume includes failed at this, failed at this, failed at this, failed at this, boom, it went right. And I think that's a human reality. You know, in other words, those who succeed at difficult things or new things often have a track record of hanging in there through failure and difficulty, you know? And, you know, as you mentioned earlier, I don't think we're so good at that as a church, as Catholics. Like, in other words, we're kind of used to it working. You know, like, you know, when I grew up, there was a way that the parish ran, and it ran like clockwork, and mothers brought their kids in to be baptized, and everybody went to Catholic school, and everybody went to, it kind of worked. Now the old ways of doing it don't work as smoothly, and I don't think we're humanly as used to. We're going to have to get used to trying things and having them not work. So that's one thing I'd say. The second, to put the same idea maybe in a more spiritual Catholic way, I once heard somebody say, look, we're in the effort business. God is in the results business.
Yes, exactly.
And, there's something to that. I mean, that's probably not 100% accurate. There is something there are things that we can do, and there are best practices and so on. But I do think, as spiritual people, when we imagine that it's all down to us and it all depends on my accomplishing it, there is something heretical about that. I mean, that's not really a Catholic idea. We sort of have the idea that things happen through God's grace ultimately. And, there is a heresy that, Pelagian, that I can earn my own salvation by everything I accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a way, I think the idea of being resilient, of letting go a little bit and letting God also be working with us, I think we can create a kind of a spirituality of resilience and dealing with failure and kind of hanging in there despite disappointment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And it's interesting what you talk about. So for those who are maybe watching this episode or unfamiliar, the Camden Diocese had a convocation of Catholic leaders, the Joy of the Gospel in South Jersey. It was a 3.5-day event, really expected to be sort of the catalytic enabler of having enabling our ability to really be a mission church, one that looks outward versus inward, one that actually is really trying to take a look in our community and go, who's in need here? Who can we take care of? How do we be the hands and feet of Jesus? And Chris, actually, we read Chris's book before we came to that convocation. And Chris was also a speaker on our last day. And so, Chris, I wanted to be able to share a story or two with you around some of the work we've seen done. So St. Mary of Mount Carmel in Hamilton, actually starting in October in collaboration with the pastor, the team that came to the convocation, every first Sunday belongs to that team. And so there's a 5 o'clock mass. There's a dinner for everyone to come to, which is sponsored. And then there's a talk. So they're really having great success in terms of who's coming into that event. They're getting their parishioners to invite others, and they've done a number of things, right? They've done a pro-life talk. They've done youth ministry talk. The one they're doing in March, because they didn't do one this month because the Super Bowl, they knew no one would show up. But the one that's coming up now is around addictions. So there's ways for events like this to happen, to actually find topics that actually invite others from the community in, because they want parishioners to invite, and come to church and see the things we do.
Yeah, good for them, and I think, so first, all kudos and power to them for trying something. And then I think the other thing that could be neat about what you guys are trying to do in Camden is there can also be a kind of a network effect. Like, in other words, if those guys are doing something that seems to be working, you can ricochet that idea around the rest of the diocese and say, okay, look, these guys tried this, seemed to work. If you want to learn more, call such a person. And it helps us to circulate good ideas quickly. It'll help Camden to circulate good ideas quickly. And also it kind of takes a little pressure off me, my power. Like, in other words, I don't have to feel like, oh man, I have to create every good idea from scratch. There's a kind of a power and support in knowing, okay, there are a few dozen of us out there, and man, between a few dozen, we're going to come up with 3, 5, 10 good ideas and circulate them, and we can learn from each other.
Yeah, see, and I think that's the really beautiful part of this, right? The sharing. So we're trying to get the word out around the things that the parishes have committed to, and actually what's successful then. We have St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, they came out of it. So they went into the convocation with their team, and we're going to talk about the Easter Project in a minute. So their Easter Project, which we really created from your book, and we helped all these 62 parishes come to the convocation with an Easter Project for their parish. They left the convocation knowing that their team of 9 or 10 could not do everything they outlined in their Easter Project. So they prayed first. They gathered in prayer. they actually engaged their parish community because they knew they needed more people on their team, and they anchored biblically to the 72. And so what they did is they wind up now with a team of 72 that they divided into 6 teams for the things from their project that they came up with.
Great. Great. Yeah. Hey, well, I don't know why you're talking to me. You should have like the people who came up with these great ideas, do little sessions with them. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're doing that too, right? So
Good.
writing articles, and we're talking about it in
Good.
social media,
Perfect.
so we want to be able
Great.
to do that. So Chris, can we talk, maybe we'll close around this for those that are watching this episode, and we're likely to attach the document to the show notes. So we created a template out of your book. So you talk about the acronym Easter, and we created a template for parish teams, leadership teams to think about. What is the Easter project, for your parish? So can you talk a little bit about Easter? Because we think that's a really important piece.
Yeah. So I used, for those who don't know, I used the acronym Easter to try to summarize some of the core ideas in the book. And I won't talk about it in great detail, but let me say what it's not first and then what it is. So what I didn't intend it as was like, this is the formula, this is the thing you have to use, this is my program that you have to use. It's in no way like that. Every once in a great while, somebody will say, we use Parish Catalyst or Amazing Parish or Dynamic Catholic. Are you saying we ought to stop using that and use Easter? I said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. The ideas I tried to share, I think, can be helpfully integrated with any program. My point in teeing that up, in using that acronym, was really 2 things. The first thing, E and A, stood for being more entrepreneurial, being more creative, being more accountable. The first part of it was really about changing the culture. Like, in other words, being a little different, be more creative, be more innovative, holding ourselves more accountable. So, in other words, the first part of Easter, to be more entrepreneurial, be more accountable, EA, is really saying whatever program we use, if we just have like a list of things to do, it ain't going to work.
Correct.
We also have to pay attention to how we do things, us as a culture. And then the other letters, S to serve the community, T to transform the hearts of people who come to our parish, R to reach out, like to the folks who have stopped coming, to young people who never come. Those parts of Easter, the end part of the acronym, was really saying, something, we need to focus. You can't just have a laundry list of 1,000 things. And you need to focus in a way on the things that are really most fundamental and most essential to our mission. Jesus told us to make disciples. Reaching out has something to do with that. Conversion is about growing closer to the Lord. T, transforming those who come to us, is something about that. And of course, Jesus told us in the Beatitudes to serve those in need, So the big idea of Easter was, the first part of it, culture change. Are we changing ourselves so that we can really be effective and successful? And then focus, are we focusing our efforts, and are we focusing in the areas that Jesus told us are most important for us?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think that's really important for all of us. Whether you went to the convocation, whether you're part of Camden Diocese or not, everyone is a leader in the Catholic Church, regardless of where you sit. And that's really part of the culture change too, is to think, where are your closest disciples? They're sitting at your kitchen table. They're your friends, they're your coworkers, they're your extended family, and then they're just the people we come across, right? Do we come across as someone who's doing the work of Jesus in this lifetime? So this is not, to your point, like, the big programs don't necessarily work. They convict a deeper. Like, what are the ways that we can think about doing things we have not done before? Because I like to use the acronym you use. We live in the 21st century, and it's filled with VUCA, right? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So how do we as Catholics go forward in this century? To the point you made early in our conversation, is we have much to offer to the world and to this culture as Catholics.
Amen to all that.
Amen to all that. Chris, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your really busy schedule to talk to us here in the Camden Diocese and beyond. It's very helpful to us. We're going to put some resources down below the link to this show so that you can more easily find them. But again, we are grateful for your gifts and your story that you have brought to the Camden Diocese. Thank you so much.